Welcome to the Berean Voice. I'm Randy Seaver. Today we're going to be looking at 2 Peter chapter 2 and verse 1. This verse has been a favorite of those who would propound the doctrine of universal redemption. But I think there are a number of important considerations that would lead us away from using this verse to try to prove such an idea. Before we look at the verse, however, I would like to share with you a comment that has been very helpful to me. This is a paragraph that is found in Robert Haldane's commentary on the Epistle of Paul to the Romans. It is Banner of Truth's reprint, reprinted in 1966. It was probably 50 years ago when I first read this comment, and I found it very, very helpful and have often referred to it, and I'd like to share it with you. One of the questions that I've asked people over the years is this: why is it so important that we have to believe that Jesus died for every single sinner on the face of the earth if we're going to preach the gospel? And I've challenged them to go to the book of Acts and consider the apostolic message, because in the apostolic message there's not a single instance in which any apostle or apostolic companion ever said to an unconverted individual or a group of unconverted individuals, you need to believe that God loved you so much that he sent his son to die for you. And if you will simply believe that he died for you, then God will justify you. And I challenge you, if you believe the doctrine of universal redemption and believe that we must tell every sinner without exception, Jesus died for you, or we can't preach the gospel to them, I challenge you to go back to the book of Acts and try to find some place where any apostle ever said to a group of individuals who were unconverted, you need to believe that Jesus died for you. Think, for example, of the Philippian jailer who came into the cell where Paul and Silas were singing praises to God after the great earthquake had occurred, and he was ready to kill himself because he was afraid they were going to escape. And Paul said, "Don't harm yourself. We're here. Don't worry." And the man said, "What must I do to be saved?" Now, what did he mean by that? I don't really know. But Paul answered the question in a spiritual way and said to him, believe that God loved you so much that he sent his son to die just for you. And if you will believe that he loved you that much to send his son and believe that Jesus died for you, then you will be saved. Well, if you know the passage, you know that isn't what Paul said at all. What Paul answered was, believe on the Lord Jesus Christ, and you will be saved in your house. Believe that Jesus is Lord. Believe that he has been exalted to the throne on the basis of what he has accomplished, and he has been invested with all the merit of his redemptive accomplishments. He is a full fountain for empty pitchers. That is the message of the gospel. So we don't need to tell every sinner we meet, Jesus died for you, in order to preach the gospel to them. Now, if you're going to follow modern evangelical evangelism, then that's what you're going to preach. But you're not going to find any warrant for preaching that in the New Testament scriptures. There come a time that we assure those who have believed Jesus died for you and you are justified based on what he has accomplished, and your justification has nothing to do with anything you can do. Yes, there comes a time that becomes part of the good news. But that is not the initial message the apostles preached to unconverted sinners. Listen to this statement by Robert Haldane on page 203 of his commentary. Many suppose that in preaching the gospel, it is necessary to tell every man that Christ died for him, and that if Christ did not actually atone for the sins of every individual, the gospel cannot be preached at all. But this is very erroneous. The gospel declares that Christ died for the guilty, and that the most guilty who believe shall be saved. It is a faithful saying and worthy of all acceptation that Christ Jesus came into the world to save sinners, even the chief of sinners. The gospel does not tell every individual to whom it is addressed that Christ died for him, but that if he believes, he shall be saved. This is a warrant to preach the gospel to all men. And it is only as he is a believer that it is known to any man that Christ died for him individually. To preach the gospel then to every man and to call on everyone to believe and be saved is quite consistent, as it is a truth that whoever believes shall be saved. If the most guilty of the human race believes in Jesus, there is the most perfect certainty that he shall be saved. If any man is straitened in preaching the gospel and finds a difficulty in calling on all men to believe, except he can at the same time tell them that Christ died for every individual of the human race, he does not clearly understand what the gospel is. It is the good news that Christ died for the most guilty that believe. Not that he died for every individual, whether he will believe or not. To the truth that every man shall be saved who believes, there is no exception. If there are any sins that will never be pardoned, they imply that the individuals guilty of them will never believe, for if they believe, they will be saved. In other words, what he's saying is, we don't need to tell every sinner, Jesus died for you. All we need to tell them is, if you believe the promise of God to justify and pardon you based on the redemptive work of Christ, you will certainly be justified. Everyone who believes will be saved. Why do you need to know any more than that? Well, let's just talk about this verse a little bit, because there are several things that I think would lead us against using this as a proof text for our doctrine one way or the other. The first thing that we notice about this particular passage is that there is no indication whatsoever that it was Peter's intention to discuss the extent of Jesus' redemptive work in these words. Let me just read the words to you so that we know exactly what Peter wrote. This is what he said in verse 1, "But there were also false prophets among the people, even as there will be false teachers among you, who will secretly bring in destructive heresies, even denying the Lord who bought them, and bring on themselves swift destruction." So here's the setup. You have those who have been bought, according to this passage, and yet those who have been bought are going to be destroyed. So the idea is that Jesus died for every single person, but many of those for whom Jesus died are going to perish in their sins simply because they have not exercised their free will and made the right decision. The idea of many who use this passage is that what the passage is saying is Jesus bought salvation for these people and offered it to them, but they are going to perish because they have rejected the offer of this free gift. The illustration that is sometimes used is that there was a man living on a particular street that had 10 children living there. He wanted to do something nice for the children, so he went down to the supermarket and bought lollipops for all 10 children, brought them back to the street, called the children out, and offered them the lollipops. Now, 5 of these children received the lollipops and enjoyed them, and 5 of them refused to receive the lollipops and frustrated this man's purpose in buying them. In other words, the idea is Jesus bought salvation so that he could offer it to everyone. It is a potential, it is a provision, but a mere provision. It does not actually secure the redemption of any sinner. This is really the synergist doctrine of the work of Christ. The work of Christ does not in itself secure anyone's salvation. And this is the evidence of that. He clearly says he bought them, and yet they're going to be lost. Now, if that's the case, then you, if you're a believer, have no security whatsoever, because your security depends not on what Jesus has accomplished, but your security depends on your willingness to receive the free gift. And so, what if you have grave doubts? Then you're in deep trouble, because your faith is lagging. And your faith is the only thing that unites you to Him. Your faith is that which effectuates the work of Jesus Christ. Remember this, and I've said this often before, I'll say it again and again. If Jesus died equally and in the same way for every sinner, and any sinner perishes, then His redemptive work could not have in and of itself secured eternal salvation for anyone. And yet the New Testament over and over and over again treats the work of Jesus Christ not as a potential or a mere provision, but as a certain accomplishment. That's important for us to understand. Now, the question that we have to ask is, does the text tell us that Jesus bought salvation for these people, and so that He might offer it to them, but they have refused to receive it and have brought on themselves swift destruction, so that in spite of the fact that Jesus offered salvation to them, they are going to perish? Is that what the verse actually states? The answer to the question is, in order for the verse to state that, you have to read that into the passage, because you can't draw it out of the passage. That's not what the verse is teaching. Now, let me remind you of that hermeneutical principle that we must always follow in trying to interpret any passage. And that hermeneutical principle is that theological doctrine is to be established based on theological passages that are intended to deal with that particular theological doctrine in particular. We gave the illustration, you don't go to passages on sanctification to study the doctrine of justification. You go to passages that are having to do with justification itself. And so the question we have to ask as we look at this verse is there any indication whatsoever that it was Peter's intention in this passage to discuss the extent of Jesus' redemptive work? And the answer to the question is absolutely not. Instead, it was his intention to warn believers of false teachers who would arise in their midst. That's what the passage is about. And so to think that we can establish the doctrine of redemption from this particular passage is erroneous. Another hermeneutical principle is that we are to establish our doctrine based on clear passages and not on obscure or ambiguous passages. Now, there is enough ambiguity in this passage to cause us to rethink the idea of trying to draw any doctrine of the atonement out of this passage. We must go to passages that are clearly intended to explicate the work of Jesus Christ as the Redeemer of His people. What are the ambiguities? Well, we have to ask the question, who is in view when we read about the despotes in this passage? That is, the sovereign Lord. Interestingly, as we find this term in other parts of the New Testament, it is in reference to God the Father and not in reference to Jesus. It's altogether possible that Peter was thinking back to Deuteronomy chapter 32 and verse 6, where we read about Yahweh buying them, establishing them as His people. And their ingratitude, even though He has established them by bringing them out of the land of Egypt, and I'll leave it to you to go back and read that verse, Deuteronomy 32:6. But it's altogether possible that he uses the word despotes here because he's referencing not Jesus, but God the Father. it is interesting that when we find this word used in other parts of the New Testament, it refers to God the Father and not to the Lord Jesus. For example, chapter 4 of Acts and verse 24, they cry out, "O sovereign Lord." And they're referring not to Jesus, but to God the Father. Another ambiguity in this particular verse is that Peter uses the word bought, and yet this word bought always in other passages that are redemptive in nature in the New Testament, the word is used 25 times, and 5 of those times would include this particular one, but in all the other 4 occurrences of this particular word that is translated bought, it has to do with the means by which that which is purchased is purchased. For example, we are told in 1 Corinthians chapter 6 and verse 20, "We are not our own, for we are bought with a price." Revelation 5:9, for example, says, "You have bought us by your blood." But here there is no purchase price mentioned. It simply says, even denying the Lord who bought them. And so it doesn't tell us who bought them. It could be God the Father, could be God the Son, could be that it has no reference whatsoever to Jesus' redemptive work, and it tells us that it does not tell us what the purchase price was, which will lead us away from the idea of thinking that this is a soteriological reference. It is more likely that he is simply referring to the fact that God has established them in their position. If he bought them, this is very important, if he bought them, then they are his. When this word is used, it has to do with going into the marketplace, laying down the purchase price, and possessing that which has been purchased. So if Jesus bought them, in other words, he did not buy salvation so that he might offer it to them, but the text tells us that he bought them. And if he bought them, then he bought them in the sense that he has the sovereign right to rule over them. And so whether it's referring to Jesus or whether it's talking about God the Father, in any case, he's saying not he bought salvation for them and offered it to them, but he's saying he bought them so that in some sense they are his. He has, not only by virtue of creation, but also by virtue of redemption, the sovereign right to rule and reign over them. And so it's very clear that we're dealing here with an ambiguous passage which cannot be used to argue that Jesus died for everyone in the world without exception, even those who are going to be lost. If you want to study that doctrine, go to very clear passages that talk about the redemptive work of Christ and God's intention in sending his Son for his people. Even John 3:16, as we have seen, does not mention any purpose of God to save those who will not believe. The whole idea is that the purpose of God is frustrated by the fact that sinners are unwilling to believe the gospel. And you hear this from people who want to use John 3:16. John 3:16, we're told, teaches very clearly that Jesus died for the purpose of saving every sinner. No, it doesn't. Listen to what the verse says again. And I'd encourage you to go back to our treatment of that verse in this series. But John 3:16 says, "For in this way God loved the world, that he gave his only begotten Son," or his uniquely begotten Son, "in order that," the Greek word is hena, it shows purpose. And so the writer is clearly setting forth the purpose of God in giving his Son, "in order that everyone believing should not perish, but should have everlasting life. The verse states absolutely nothing about any purpose of God to save those who will not believe. It simply says it was the purpose of God in giving his Son that everyone believing should not perish. Now we can go to other passages and find out who those are. Who are those who are going to believe? And the answer is they are those whom the Father has given to the Son to be redeemed. And he is going to accomplish their salvation and raise them up again at the last day. That's very clear. And so if you're going to look at passages like this, look at what the passages actually teach and not what you want them to teach. How often have I heard people say, well, John 3:16 teaches that God gave his Son to die for every single sinner. No, the verse doesn't say that. And so don't try to imagine that the verse says that. That's not what the verse is saying at all. And we could go to other verses that are just like that. But we're going to do that after we look at some of these verses that have been used, such as 1 John 2:2, and perhaps even Romans chapter 8, verses 12 through 19. And then we're going to simply look at some verses that very clearly state the purpose of the Son in giving himself as a sacrifice for his people. Well, I hope that's been helpful to you. Until next time, may God richly bless you.